everybody. Get your engines fired up. It's time for Lights Out, Let's Chat.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Lights Out, Let's Chat. You know, the podcast where we break down everything happening in Formula One. The drama, the strategy, the chaos, and occasionally the memes. And honestly, the Chinese Grand Prix weekend had a little bit of everything. We had experimental car parts that looked like they were auditioning for a dance competition, a rookie making Formula One history, Mercedes suddenly reminding everyone they still know how to win races, and we can't forget a certain Dutch driver comparing Formula One to Mario Kart, which honestly might be the most accurate description of the new regulations we've heard so far. So, buckle up, because we've got a lot to unpack from the weekend at the Shanghai International Circuit. Let's start where every race weekend starts, practice. Free Practice 1 kicked off the weekend in Shanghai, and right away, teams were trying to understand how their cars behave on this circuit. Shanghai is definitely a tricky track. The opening corners are long, sweeping turns that absolutely destroy front tires. And then you've got one of the longest straights on the calendar. So, teams are constantly trying to balance downforce for the corners with straight line speed. Basically, engineers spend the entire weekend arguing with themselves. Now, early in the session, the track looked pretty dusty, which is normal for Shanghai. And we saw a few drivers running wide while trying to find the grip. The first few laps of practice session are basically drivers asking the car, okay, how much chaos are you planning to cause today? Are you really trying to stress me out? One of the more tense moments of FP1 involved Lewis Hamilton and Lando Norris. Hamilton moved across the track while Norris was approaching pretty quickly, which created a pretty close call. But luckily, nothing actually happened. No contact, no damage, but it definitely got a few engineers nervously reaching for the stress necks. I don't blame them. I would have done the exact same thing. But Hamilton also had a small spin later in the session, which showed that drivers were still trying to dial in the balance of their cars. Meanwhile, over at Ferrari, they brought out one of the most interesting engineering experiences we have seen this season. They tested a rotating rear wing that fans immediately nicknamed the Macarena Wing. Yes, the fans have called it the Macarena Wing. You know, the dance that everyone likes to do. Because apparently, Ferrari engineers woke up and thought, what if our rear wing danced? Listen, the concept was designed to reduce drag on the long straight while still producing downforce in the corners. It was very creative, very bold, but slightly chaotic. And after reviewing the data, Ferrari decided to remove it later in the weekend due to reliability concerns. So, the Macarena Wing danced its last dance. But honestly, Ferrari, you get points for creativity. Next up was sprint qualifying. And this session gave us our first big surprise of the weekend. George Russell delivered an incredible lap to put his Mercedes on sprint pole. But wait, there's a bigger headline to this. His teammate, Kimi Antonelli, qualified second, which meant Mercedes locked out the entire front row. Now that's a big statement early for this season. Right behind them was Norris for McLaren, followed by Hamilton for Ferrari. Then came Oscar Piastri, Charles Leclerc, and Pierre Gasly. Yes, you heard me right. Pierre Gasly. But one of the biggest surprises was that Max Verstappen qualifying only 8th for Red Bull, which is definitely not a position we're used to seeing him start from. Usually, Verstappen starts somewhere near, the front, preferably already halfway to the podium. So, seeing him down in P8 definitely raised some eyebrows in the paddock. When the lights went out for the sprint race, Russell managed to hold the lead into turn 1 and control the pace early. Now, sprint races are short, only about 100 kilometers. If you're American, that's 62 miles. So, drivers don't have much time to make moves, which means everything happens fast, and sometimes a little too aggressively. But one of the standout performances came from Oscar Piastri, who pushed forward and kept pressures on the cars ahead. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen was trying to climb through the field from 8th. And while he did make some progress, it was clear Red Bull didn't quite have the pace they usually do. By the end of sprint race, the big takeaway was simple. Mercedes looked quick, like really quick, and suddenly the rest of the grid had a problem. Now, let's talk about qualifying, because this session gave us one of the biggest stories of the entire weekend. Kimi Antonelli delivered a stunning lap to take pole position, and with that lap, he became the youngest pole sitter in Formula One history, breaking a record previously held by Sebastian Vettel. Guys, he's only 19 years old. I repeat, he's only 19 years old. Most of us, while we were 19, were struggling to figure out college schedules, financial issues. Antonelli is out here taking pole positions in Formula One. Obviously behind him was Russell, giving Mercedes a front row lockout. Then came the Ferraris of Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. That gave Ferrari a second row lockout. Now they were followed by the McLarens of Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris. But once again, Max Verstappen qualified 8th, which made it pretty clear that Red Bull was having a difficult weekend. Now don't worry, Red Bull fans. I'm sure things will get better at some point. Don't know when, but at some point. Now, the race itself delivered a huge moment for the sport. Antonelli converted his pole position into his first Formula One victory, and he did it with impressive composure. Leading a Formula One race at 19 years old is probably not easy, especially when you have drivers like Lewis Hamilton and George Russell right behind you. But Antonelli stayed calm and controlled the race from the front. Russell finished second, giving Mercedes a dominant 1-2 finish. Now, Lewis Hamilton finished third, securing his first podium for Ferrari, which is a pretty big milestone for that partnership. One thing that always deserves attention in Formula One races is the midfield battles, because sometimes the fight for P6 or P7 is actually more exciting than the fight for the lead. And this race definitely had some great midfield action. Drivers like Oliver Bearman and Pierre Gasly were battling hard for point positions. Now, these drivers know that every point matters, especially for the teams fighting in the Constructors' Championship. We also saw strong drives from Liam Lawson and Isaac Hadjar. And honestly, the midfield fights often produce some of the best racing because those drivers are pushing the absolute limit, trying to gain even one position. No conserving tires, no playing it safe, just full send commitment. Now, let's talk about the drivers who didn't make it to the finish. Max Verstappen retired during the race. Fernando Alonso also retired after reporting heavy vibrations in the car. And the biggest shock, and it breaks my heart to say this, neither McLaren car even started the race. Both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri had technical failures before the start. So, McLaren ended the weekend with a double DNS, which is about as rough a race day as you can have. Let's dive into some of the teams, starting with Mercedes, because this might have been their strongest weekend in quite some time. Front row lockout, pole position, and the pace looked strong across every session. If this performance continues, Mercedes could very quickly find themselves back in the championship fight. Ferrari also had a solid weekend. Lewis Hamilton finishing on the podium for Ferrari is a big moment for the team, especially considering how much attention that driver got when he moved during the off-season. And Charles Leclerc finishing close behind shows Ferrari definitely has competitive pace. Now, McLaren. This one's gonna hurt for my McLaren fans, because both Norris and Piastri both Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri looked quick earlier in the weekend, but neither car actually started the race. Both drivers suffered technical issues before the race even began, which means McLaren went from potential podium contenders to scoring absolutely 0 points. That's the kind of weekend that makes engineers stare at laptops in complete silence. Then there's Red Bull, and this was an unusually tough weekend for them. Max Verstappen struggled with the handling and described the car as difficult to drive, which is something we don't hear from him very often. So, clearly something wasn't quite working for them in Shanghai. Alright, and now for your F1 news of the week. This is probably going to be the funniest thing that had happened this weekend. Max Verstappen joked that instead of using the Red Bull simulator, he's been practicing by playing Mario Kart on his Nintendo Switch. That's right. He said finding the mushrooms was going well, but the blue shells was more difficult. Obviously, he was joking, but the comment was actually a pretty clever dig at the new 2026 regulations. The new cars rely heavily on electric energy deployment. Drivers constantly manage battery usage and energy recovery, which means sometimes cars suddenly gain huge bursts of speed, kind of like video game boost, which is why drivers and fans have started comparing it to Mario Kart. And honestly, the internet memes this week have been incredible. People are already joking about Ferrari throwing banana peels during pit stops, and Red Bull saving a blue shell for the final lap. Man, Formula 1 fans are just so creative. Now, if you guys haven't checked out any of these memes, I totally recommend it. It'll give you a good laugh if you need one. So, what did we learn from the Chinese Grand Prix? Well, Mercedes might be back. Ferrari looks competitive. The midfield battles are getting intense. And a 19-year-old rookie just made Formula One history. If the rest of the season is anything like this weekend, we're in for a very entertaining championship fight. That's it for today's episode of Lights Out, Let's Chat. If you enjoyed this recap, make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss future race breakdowns. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you next time.
From Lights Out to the checkered flag, this has been Lights Out, Let's Chat podcast. We'll see you next time.